The British Philatelic Bureau does not smell like history. That was the first thing Jamie noticed when they pulled up outside the Georgian sandstone building on Leith's waterfront. Edinburgh's harbour light coming in grey and flat off the Firth of Forth, the kind of morning that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be autumn yet. He'd expected something ancient and dusty, the kind of institution that smells of old paper and consequence. Instead, the lobby smelled of fresh paint and carpet cleaner, and a woman in a charcoal blazer was already watching them through the glass door, with the expression of someone who had been watching and finding things inadequate for quite some time. That, Amanda said quietly, without moving her lips, is a woman who has never once in her life touched the wrong thing. Jamie looked at the woman looked at Jamie. Right, he said, I'll be on my best behavior. He was not on his best behavior for very long. Her name was Margaret Forsyth, and she had been head archivist at the British Philatelic Bureau for 31 years, and she shook their hands with the precise grip of someone who had decided exactly how much warmth was appropriate, and had not exceeded it since approximately 1997. She was 61. Silver-haired, with reading glasses on a chain that she hadn't put on yet, and she wore the patient expression of a person who had explained important things to unimportant people for so long that the patience had calcified into something that looked, from a distance, almost like serenity. "Welcome," she said, in a voice that suggested the word had a very specific and limited meaning. "His Royal Highness Prince George will be joining us at past. In the meantime, I'll walk you through the ground floor collection so you understand the context for today's visit." She looked at Jamie the way a museum security guard looks at a man in a puffy jacket. "The cases are alarmed." "Brilliant," Jamie said. "I wasn't going to." "The motion sensors," Margaret continued, addressing Amanda, "activate if a hand comes within 15 centimeters of the glass." "Right," Jamie said. "No, that's completely fine." Amanda looked at the ceiling. The ground floor was long and quietly extraordinary. Display cases ran the length of both walls, lit from below with the careful amber glow of lighting designed to preserve rather than impress, and inside each case, mounted on pale gray archival board, were stamps. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Tiny rectangles of paper that had crossed oceans, survived wars, passed through the hands of Victorian postmasters and Edwardian housewives and soldiers writing home from the Somme. Margaret walked them through the timeline with the measured cadence of someone who had given this particular explanation many times, and had long ago stopped expecting her audience to grasp its full significance. "The penny black," she said, pausing before a case near the far end of the room, "was issued on the 6th of May, 1840. The world's first adhesive postage stamp. Before this, the recipient paid for a letter upon delivery. The penny black transferred that cost to the sender." She let that sit for a moment. "The entire concept of modern postal communication rests on that decision." "Incredible," Amanda said. Said Jamie, who was looking at a stamp in the adjacent case that appeared to have a small dog on it. "Mr. Deacon," Margaret said. Jamie looked up. "That case," she said, "is also alarmed." Jamie's hand, which had been drifting in the direction of the glass in the purely abstract way that hands sometimes drift, stopped moving. I was gesturing," he said, illustratively. Margaret looked at him for one full second. Then she turned back to Amanda and continued the tour. Prince George arrived at 29 minutes past 10. There was no motorcade. There was a black car, and then a side door opened, and then a boy of 10 walked into the lobby wearing dark trousers and a pale blue jumper, and a backpack that had, Jamie noticed, a small scuff on the bottom left corner from what looked like considerable use. He was accompanied by one aide, a quiet man in his 30s, who positioned himself near the door with the practiced invisibility of someone very good at their job, and a protection officer who did the same near the window. George himself walked directly to Margaret Forsyth and held out his hand. "Good morning," he said. I'm George, thank you for having me. Margaret shook his hand. Something in her face, not her expression exactly, more the quality behind it, shifted, the way a held breath shifts when it releases. Good morning, Your Royal Highness, she said. We're very pleased you're here. George looked around the lobby with the frank, evaluating look of a child who is genuinely trying to understand a place rather than perform understanding of it. His eyes went to the display cases, then to the amber lighting, then, briefly, to Jamie and Amanda. Hello, he said. Hi, said Amanda warmly. I'm Amanda, this is Jamie, we're from Heart FM. Is it all right if we follow along today? Yes, that's fine. He considered Jamie for a moment. Are you nervous? A little bit, Jamie admitted. Margaret's already caught me twice. George looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Jamie. George nodded slowly, with the careful neutrality of someone filing information away. Right, said Margaret, and the tour began. The archives proper were one floor down, through a door that required a key card and a second door that required Margaret specifically. And the temperature dropped by 4 degrees as they descended, the air changing from the lobby's Carpetan paint civility to something older and more serious, the particular atmosphere of rooms where things are kept because they matter. The main archive room was not what Jamie had imagined. He'd imagined wooden cabinets and brass handles and a rolling ladder on a rail, the movie version of an archive. What he got was a long, climate-controlled room with pale walls and adjustable shelving and flat archival drawers, each one labeled in Margaret's own handwriting. He somehow knew, in the kind of script that had been taught in schools that no longer existed. At the far end, a large examination table sat under a bank of daylight spectrum lamps, and on it, laid out on archival foam with the precise spacing of a museum exhibition, were 12 stamps. George walked to the table and looked at them without touching anything. These are the ones you selected, he asked Margaret. Yes, a range from 1840 to 1953. I thought we'd trace the evolution of royal portraiture through the philatelic record, if that suits. That suits, George said, which was, Jamie thought, a remarkably composed thing for a 10-year-old to say. And then immediately thought that perhaps he shouldn't be surprised, and then immediately thought that he was surprised anyway, and that this was going to be a more interesting morning than he'd anticipated. Margaret put on her reading glasses and began. She was, Jamie discovered, an entirely different person when she was talking about stamps. Not warmer, exactly. Warmth wasn't the shift, but more present, more alive. The way a musician is more alive when they are playing than when they are standing in a car park. She moved along the table with the unhurried confidence of someone in the one room in the world where they are most completely themselves. And she talked about each stamp with a specificity and affection that made them feel not like artifacts but like characters. This is the first Machin Definitive Series, 1967, she said, indicating a small, clean stamp with the Queen's profile in stark relief. Arnold Machin's portrait. No country named Britain was the only country that didn't need one, being the inventors of the postal stamp. That's still true today. She paused. The portrait was based on a plaster cast Machin made in a single sitting. The Queen wore no jewelry. He wanted nothing to compete with the face. George leaned in, not close enough to breathe on it, just close enough to see. Why did they choose that angle, he asked. The 3/4 profile, why not straight on? Margaret looked at him. Because straight on, she said, reads as confrontational. 3/4 is authority without aggression. She paused. It's a very old design principle. Coins have used it for 2,000 years. So it's the same reason portraits in the National Gallery. George stopped. Sorry, keep going. No, said Margaret, finish the thought. George looked at the stamp. So it's the same reason portraits in the National Gallery position the subject at 3/4 angle. It's not aesthetic, it's political. It's a decision about how power wants to present itself. The room was quiet for a moment. Yes, said Margaret, exactly that. Jamie looked at Amanda. Amanda looked at Jamie. Neither of them said anything. Margaret moved to the next stamp. The running gag, it should be noted, did not stop simply because the intellectual stakes had been raised. 40 minutes into the tour, while Margaret was explaining the significance of the 1935 Silver Jubilee issue and George was asking whether the slight tonal variation in the blue was a deliberate choice or a printing inconsistency, Jamie's elbow made contact with the edge of a foam storage tray on the adjacent shelf. The tray did not fall, but it moved. Margaret did not look at him. She was still talking to George, but her right hand came back and resettled the tray to its exact original position without breaking her sentence, with the unconscious precision of someone who had been resettling disturbed trays for 31 years. "Sorry," Jamie said. "You said Margaret." Amanda made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and was not quite anything else. George glanced at Jamie with an expression that was, Jamie felt, very much his father's, a genuine effort at sympathy that was struggling quite hard against the alternative. "It's fine," George said, which was kind of him. "Margaret, can I ask, is that one different?" He was pointing to a stamp at the far left of the table, not the one Margaret had been about to discuss. One she'd placed there almost incidentally, slightly apart from the others, on a small separate square of foam, as if it had its own gravity. Margaret looked at where he was pointing. "That," she said after a pause that was a fraction longer than her other pauses, "is a 1840 penny black, plate 1B, issue number 11. She moved to it. "You'll notice the bottom margin." George leaned in. The impression is off. The corner letter is slightly misaligned." "Yes." "Is that a printing error?" "It is." "So it's a misprint?" "Technically, yes." George straightened up and looked at it for a moment longer. Then he said, "Did the person who sent the letter know they had a misprint?" The room went very still. Not dramatically still. Not the silence of something portentous arriving. Just still. The particular stillness of a room when someone has said the precise, unexpected thing that unlocks a door that has been waiting for 30 years. Margaret took off her reading glasses. She looked at the stamp, then at George, then at the stamp again. "No," she said quietly. "They didn't. They almost certainly never knew." She was quiet for a moment. "There are 11 known examples of this particular error. 11 letters that were posted in 1840 by ordinary people who had no idea that the stamp on their envelope was different from every other stamp in Britain." She paused. "We don't know what was in the letters. We don't know who sent them or who received them. We just have the stamps." "So the letters are gone," George said, "but the stamps survived." "Yes. The important part got lost, and the unimportant part got kept." Margaret looked at him. Philatelists would dispute the characterization of the stamp as unimportant. "I know," George said, "but the person who sent it didn't think that. They were just writing to someone." There was a silence that Amanda, to her credit, did not fill. Jamie had been doing a lot of not speaking for the last 40 minutes, and he was finding, to his own surprise, that this was not actually that difficult. He was also finding, which was more surprising, that he was genuinely interested in what was going to happen next. Margaret put her reading glasses back on, then took them off again. "I've shown this stamp to a great many people," she said, in a tone that was not quite her archivist voice and not quite anything else either. "In 31 years, curators, collectors, scholars, donors, school groups." She looked at the stamp. "You're the first person who asked about the letter." George looked at the stamp. "It seems like the more important question." "It is," said Margaret. "It always was." She put her glasses back on and was herself again, or her archive self, which was the most herself she was, and the tour continued. But something had shifted in the room, calibrated slightly differently now. The way a room feels different after a window has been opened and closed again, even though the temperature hasn't changed. The The staff room at the bureau was not quite the disaster Amanda had privately feared. It was small and functional and slightly tired, in the way that staff rooms in institutions are always slightly tired, with a kettle that had seen things and a notice board whose edges had curled away from the wall in protest at something pinned there in 2019 and never removed. There were 4 staff members present: Helen, the deputy archivist who had brought shortbread; David, who handled conservation and had ink on his left hand in the permanent way of a person who had simply accepted this about himself; Catriona, who managed the Bureau's public programs and was trying not to visibly vibrate with excitement at the current situation; and Robert, who was the director and had been deployed in the corner to look administrative. Amanda had, in the previous evening, arranged with Helen for Heart FM to contribute a small gesture, a proper coffee machine, because the one in the staff room appeared to be producing something that met the technical definition of coffee without capturing its spirit, and a new set of mugs, because the existing ones had reached that stage of institutional crockery evolution where they communicate subliminally that no one is expected to enjoy themselves. The coffee machine was revealed with slightly less ceremony than Amanda had intended, because the box it came in was awkward to carry and Jamie dropped his end of it on the step. But the reaction from Helen and Catriona was genuine and warm, and David said, "Oh, that's brilliant," with the specific gratitude of a man for whom good coffee is not an indulgence, but a structural requirement. George accepted a cup of tea and sat at the table with Margaret and asked her, with no preamble, what her favorite stamp in the entire collection was. This was, apparently, a question no one had asked her before either. "Not the rarest," he said. "Not the most historically significant, your favorite." Margaret considered this for a long time. Long enough that Catriona glanced at Helen and Helen glanced at David, and Robert straightened slightly in his corner. 1953, Margaret said finally. "Coronation commemorative, the set of 4. She set her tea down. "Most people focus on the design, Wilding's portrait, the frame, very fine. But what I think about is the logistics." She looked at George. Hundreds of millions of stamps produced and distributed in the weeks before and after a single day across every post office in Britain and the Commonwealth. An enormous, complicated, error-prone operation that somehow, almost entirely, worked. She paused. People received their letters on time despite everything. "Despite everything," George repeated. "We were still rationing in 1953, Margaret said. "The country was tired, and someone decided that the stamps needed to be beautiful anyway." She picked up her tea. "I find that worth noting." George was quiet for a moment. "My great-grandmother was 26, he said, "at the coronation." "Yes," said Margaret. "She must have been terrified." Margaret looked at him. "I expect so," she said, "but the stamps were beautiful." It was, Jamie thought, the most elegant exchange he'd been in the room for in quite some time, and he had been in the room for a lot of exchanges. He reached for a piece of shortbread. His elbow caught his tea. The mug, one of the new ones, skidded 2 inches across the table before Amanda's hand stopped it, without Amanda looking up from her notes, with the automatic reflex of a person who had been preventing Jamie from catastrophe for long enough that she no longer needed to allocate conscious attention to it. "Thank you," Jamie said. Said Amanda. Margaret looked at him with an expression that had evolved over the course of the morning, from professional wariness to something that was almost, nearly, if you were generous, fond. "Mr. Deacon," she said, "do you have a favorite stamp?" Jamie blinked. "Me." "You've been here 3 hours. He thought about it, actually thought about it, which surprised him. "The one with the printing error," he said. "The penny black, the misprint." "Why?" "Because someone just posted a letter. They didn't know anything was special about it. They just needed to send something to someone and they licked the stamp and stuck it on and sent it off." He paused. "And then 180 years later a child asks the right question about it and suddenly it means something new." He looked at George, who was looking at him with the careful, assessing look he'd had since the lobby. I just think that's, I don't know. Nice. Nice, Margaret repeated. Sorry, Jamie said. I know that's not the technical term. No, she said, but it's accurate. The presentation happened in the entrance hall, back under the amber lights with the long cases on either side, and Edinburgh's grey bright morning pressing against the glass of the front door. Robert, fulfilling his administrative destiny, presented George with a framed set of replicas. The penny black, the 1953 coronation set, the match-in definitive and wrapped separately in tissue, as if it needed its own moment, a museum-quality facsimile of the Plate 1B misprint. The same stamp. The same slight misalignment in the corner letter. Identical, except it hadn't been on anyone's letter in 1840 and never would be. George looked at it for a long time. Thank you, he said. Really, this is, he stopped. I'm going to put this somewhere I can see it. Robert beamed. Catriona looked like she might need to sit down. Margaret stood slightly apart, the way she'd stood slightly apart all morning, present, watchful, not performing warmth she didn't feel. And George, before he walked to the door, walked to her instead. Thank you, he said, for the question, the one about the three-quarter portrait. You answered it yourself, Margaret said. I wouldn't have if you hadn't waited. She looked at him for a moment. Come back, she said. When you're older, there are parts of the archive I didn't show you today. I will, he said. And then, because he was 10 and he had been composure and precision and genuine interest all morning, he said, Is it all right if I tell my dad about the misprint? In the voice of a child telling someone good news and wanting permission to be excited about it. And it was the most 10-year-old thing he'd said all day. And it was, without question, the best thing he'd said all day. Please do, said Margaret. He went through the door and the black car was there and the aide was there. And the protection officer was there. And then he was gone. And the lobby was quieter in the particular way that rooms are quieter after a presence has left them. Not emptier, just differently proportioned. Amanda looked at Margaret. Can I ask, in 31 years, what's the question you get asked most often? Margaret considered. How much are they worth, she said. Amanda nodded. And the question you get asked least often. Until this morning, Margaret said, what was in the letters? Jamie touched the display case on the way out. Not on purpose, or not entirely on purpose. His coat caught the corner of it as he turned to say goodbye to Helen, and the case didn't move and nothing was damaged and the alarm didn't go off, but Margaret saw it, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him all morning. That look that had started as professional warning and had traveled over 3 hours, through exasperation and something like amusement, and had arrived. Finally, at a destination that Jamie could only describe as reluctant affection, and she said nothing at all. Which was, he decided, better than anything she could have said. Brilliant morning, Amanda said, on the pavement outside, Edinburgh's salt air coming off the Forth and the fog from earlier entirely gone now, the water flat and silver in the late morning light. Really brilliant. She's extraordinary, Jamie said. Margaret. She is. George is going to remember that stamp his whole life. Amanda looked at the building. Margaret is going to remember that question her whole life. She paused. She already has been, I think. She just didn't know someone was going to ask it. They stood there for a moment in the good way you stand somewhere, when you've been somewhere worth being. Right, Jamie said, breakfast. You've had 2 pieces of shortbread. That's not breakfast, that's geology. Come on, eggs. They walked up the waterfront toward Leith's morning, and behind them the bureau's door closed with a sound like a flat drawer sliding shut in a climate-controlled room. And inside, Margaret Forsyth walked back to the archive, and put her reading glasses on, and stood for a moment in front of the Plate 1B penny black, the slight misalignment in the corner letter catching the amber light the same way it had for 31 years. She thought about a letter. She thought about someone in 1840 who had needed to send something to someone, and had licked a stamp and pressed it on, and sent it off without knowing anything about it. She thought about a 10-year-old boy who had asked about the letter instead of the stamp. Then she opened her flat drawer and began the catalog she'd been meaning to finish since Tuesday, because the archive did not stop being the archive.